Welcome to the Conceptual Design training class for SpaceClaim. Today you're going to learn how you can use SpaceClaim to get to go from an idea for a design to a finished design as quickly as possible. Today we're going to be designing a medical cart assembly, and before we get started there's a couple of options that I'd like to change in my SpaceClaim options menu. So to get to the SpaceClaim options menu, we go to the application menu in the top left and choose SpaceClaim options. Under the popular options, two settings that you should have checked off are show status messages in the design window, which allows you to see a status message in the top left of the design window, guiding you through the tool selection. And another setting that I have is that I have the tool guide positioned on the left-hand side. And that is a personal preference, and you can update that how you see fit. Under the units options, we can change the units. In this case, we're going to use millimeters for our for this design. Under advanced, we want to make sure that we check off auto extrude revolve sketches in section mode, and also automatically show power selection results. And I'll explain those as we get to them. So let's start our design. And the first thing that I'd like to do is to change my orientation of my sketch plane. So I'm going to click sketch plane in the tool guide on the bottom right, and you can see that as I hover over my screen I can select on a new orientation. Now let's create our first cylinder. I'm going to click the cylinder tool and then create a height, and I can type in a definite value of 400 millimeters, and then I can pull that out to expand that to the diameter that I'd like. We'll give that a rough estimate since we're just looking to get a concept down. So you can see under the display tab in your ribbon, we can alter some of the displays here. So we can fade the scene under the grid or clip the scene above the grid, and we can play with those to get the view that we'd like. And also just a quick review of the interface with SpaceClaim: middle mouse button to spin, shift and middle mouse button to pan, and control and middle mouse button to zoom in and out. So let's continue sketching with another cylinder, and we'll click Plan View in the Orient group to get a heads-up view of our geometry that we're creating. So I'd like to snap to the midpoint on the top of the cylinder I just created, and I'm going to drag up 90 degrees and create a longer tower for the tower of this medical cart. And then again, choose the diameter and complete that. I'm going to select my rectangle tool in the sketch group on the ribbon, and now I'm going to sketch a quick rectangle for the base at the bottom of this part. Now notice when I create that rectangle, I am just given a two-dimensional surface that it's creating with that sketch. However, if I change to sketch mode and now create a rectangle, you'll notice that I have 3 dimensions to toggle between, and it's added that depth dimension, which I'm going to update to 60 millimeters. And I can change the other dimensions as well by tabbing between them, and when I've specified all 3 dimensions, I'll hit enter, and it'll create that rectangle. And because of my option that I had set earlier to auto extrude revolve in section mode, I'm getting a depth when I sketch in section mode, but not for the rectangle that I created in sketch mode. Now I'd like to create my table for this medical cart. So you can see I can, again, still in section mode, specify a depth for that table of 600 millimeters, snap that to my tower on the right, and complete that rectangular sketch. Now I'd like to split my face along the front of this large rectangle. It's representing my chair, and so I'll split that halfway down, and using my pull tool, I'll be able to pull on the top half of that face to make that look more like the shape of a chair. And then I'll create a quick cylinder, sketching that to connect between the chair and the base as a stand for that chair. And then I'll sketch a couple more cylinders at the top of my medical cart assembly representing the arm. So I'll come off the other side, sketch a quick rectangle, quick cylinder, and then snapping to the center of that cylinder, we'll sketch a second cylinder coming off at an angle from that. Finally, I'll sketch a sphere to create geometry to fill in the gap between those two cylinders. So you can see that I've got a good layout in section mode of my design. If I switch back to 3D mode and go to a home view, you can see the different components that I've created here. I'd like to pull out that base, so I'm going to select on that rectangle that I created, and you see that as a surface in the structure tree. Select on that surface, so you can see the various solids that I've created. We'll select on that surface, choose Pull Both Sides from my tool guide that pops up above my mouse cursor, and when I pull that on both sides, you'll notice that what happens in my structure tree is that it merges with the other solids that it intersects with. And so we don't want that to happen, so let's undo from our Quick Access toolbar, and instead let's toggle on this option on the left, No Merge. So now when we pull both sides and we have our No Merge option selected either on the options on the left or from our tool guide, we'll be able to expand out that surface into a solid, but you'll notice that in the structure tree it does not merge with any of the other solids that it collides with. So we can do a little bit more work to rearrange these solids into the exact structure that we'd like. So using Split Solid tool from our Intersect group, we can split that entire tower solid along the top of our base cylinder, and that will split that tower into two separate cylinders. And so again, the option that you should toggle on is under the popular options, show status messages in the design window, and that's going to give you that tooltip telling me to select the cutter plane for this split solid tool. It's very helpful when you're learning the software. So you can see I've split that now into two separate pieces. I can also use the combine tool from the Intersect group to be able to combine two solids together, and you can read that status message that shows up in the top left. So I'm going to select on my base. Now notice that it's asking me to select a cutter object to cut into that base, but I can also toggle between the merge feature by holding down Control or selecting it in the tool guide. So as I hold down Control, I can now select on another body, and it will merge those two together instead of cutting. So let's look at our structure tree again. We can see that we have our table, our arm, our chair, our base, and our tower, all as individually defined solids. And we can also take those and create components from them by selecting on all 5 of the solids, holding down right mouse button, and choosing Move Each to New Component. And now we have a new component representing each of those solids in our structure tree. So we can also edit these, the display of these solids if we want to make it more drastic to show the difference. So I can triple click on my table, go to Color in the Display tab, and change that to a blue color. Now, if I'm going to be changing colors on a lot of my components, I can add that to my Quick Access toolbar by clicking on the drop-down from the Quick Access toolbar, choosing to edit my Quick Access toolbar. And when I go to my Customize in the Options menu, which pops up, I can search for that under the Style group, choose Color, and add that to my Quick Access toolbar. And now you see that color tool appears next to Undo and Redo in the Quick Access toolbar. I can select on an edge of my part, go to my Quick Access toolbar, and change the color of that part. So this is a basic shape of our design, but we can also specify some more advanced components. So for example, the chair component, I have a more detailed model designed in SolidWorks, so I can right click on that component, choose Replace Component, and now search for the SolidWorks component that I'd like to replace with in my File menu that pops up. You can see from the drop-down the list of various CAD formats that SpaceClaim can read in. So we'll toggle for SolidWorks files, and it'll show us SolidWorks files in our file browser. When I find that office chair assembly, I'll bring that in. And so SolidWorks data can be imported just as easily as SpaceClaim data and edited using the same exact tools that you're used to using in SpaceClaim. So that office chair is going to come in with the exact assembly arrangement that was created in SolidWorks. So I've got the chair assembly and the wheel assembly subassemblies. And I can toggle those that wheel subassembly off to choose not to display that in my model. I'd also like to replace my arm on the right hand side of this design. So let's right click and replace component again. Go to our file filter for Pro Engineer files. I'm going to choose that Pro Engineer file to bring in to replace that arm component. So you'll notice that the arm component comes into our assembly, again with the same structure that it was built in Pro Engineer. And it comes a little bit off of the assembly, so let's adjust our tower so that it's ready to fit in, so that the arm is ready to mount onto that tower. So what I'd like to do, you'll notice that the arm has two separate cylinders. So let's edit our cylindrical mount so that it can take the correct mating for that arm. So we're going to pull on the center axis, which creates a slot, but it's going in the wrong direction. So let's escape out of that, change our pull direction from our tool guides, and specify a pull direction along the front of that table. Now you can see that I'm able to create a slot in the correct direction, and if I toggle on pull both sides for my pull options on the left, I can now create that slot symmetrically in both directions. Now I'd like to so you can see that as I pull on a face of that slot, it's going to maintain that slot association the way that it was created. But I can right click and remove association to prevent that association, and now when I pull on that face, it just pulls on it as SpaceClaim would handle any face on geometry. So I'd like to now split this mount to create two separate cylinders. So let's choose split face and split the top face of that part. And first thing I need to do is to deselect the current face that I selected, or that was pre-selected. So I'll click in white space and then click on the face to select that. Notice that by default it's giving me UV vectors to split that face, but I can toggle to my tool guide with the saw tool to select a cutter face. And if I select that front rounded face, it'll split that top face according to that geometry, and I get now two faces. I can select on that face again to split it a second time, choose the back rounded face, and now I've split that top into three separate coincident faces. I can pull on that middle segment to remove material to create those two arms. So you'll notice that if I select on that face on my component and pull on it, it's going to pull on that geometry. But if I hold down Control and pull, it'll copy that face and give me a copied face, and I can copy that twice, holding down Control to create two new supports. Now if I Control select both of those faces, you'll see that by default it asks me to blend, but I can toggle that option off, and then I can pull those faces up to create solids. You'll notice in the structure tree that those two solids that I just created are represented at the top level, and so they were not created as part of that mount, but I can easily merge them together using the Combine tool. And I want to merge that with my mount, or my tower. So using the Combine tool, I can select on one component, again hold down Control to toggle to the Merge feature of Combined, and then Control select the other two solids, and I get one solid in my structure tree. Now that solid was represented at the top level because I selected one of my supports first. But I can undo that very easily and instead select on my mount first to specify that as the base component that I'd like to merge the other two. So now I'll hold down Control, select my two support brackets, and you notice that those are now merged into the solid within the tower component in the structure tree. So now let's assemble that arm that I imported from Pro Engineer. So I'd like to specify that assembly constraint by selecting on the two axes through the arm and through the mount, and choosing my center command from the assembly group on my ribbon. You notice that it'll assemble those two constraints together, moving the first selection to meet up with the second selection. Now you'll also notice that that I need to make a few more adjustments to my mount before that'll fit correctly. So let's position our arm on the model first, and then we'll adjust our mount. So I can select on the arm in my structure tree, drag it along the blue arrow using the Move tool, and that's going to move that in place between my two support brackets. And now let's change both the diameter of that mounting arm, that mounting assembly. So I can change that manually, or use the Pull Up To command to make sure that it's the same diameter as the inside cylindrical wall of my arm. So I can click on the solid, choose the Up To command, and then choose a reference for the inside cylinder of that arm. Now I'd like to make sure that my two arms are in place correctly, so I'll select on the center axis using the Move tool and move that center axis up to the inside wall, or up to the axis for the arm. And now I have a perfect fit between those two components. So I'd now like to create some additional geometry. We want to put a monitor into this medical cart assembly. So I'm going to start building that without having to sketch any new component. I'll use the existing features that I have on screen. So using my Pull tool, if I select on an edge by default using the Pull tool, it's going to create a round on that edge. And you can see that that on screen there when I pull on that mounting tower. But if I click and go to my mini tool guide, I can choose to extrude the edge, copy the edge, or pivot the edge as well. So I'm going to show the Extrude Edge tool. You'll notice that based on the direction that I'd like to extrude that out, I can extrude that into a surface. Then if I choose the other direction, I can extrude that down into my body, creating a surface in my structure tree. I can then pull out that new surface that I created, creating a solid in my structure tree. And now let's create a new component to fit that solid into. I'll right-click on Design 1, choose New Component, and name that Monitor. And now I'll drag the solid that I created down into that component level, and so we have a new component to house that monitor. So I'd like to make a few more edits to the geometry. Again, clicking on the edge, choosing Copy Edge option, I'll copy that edge inward, creating a new face on the top of that solid, and then I'll pull up on that face to add geometry. I can select on the two edges on either side of this solid, choose the Extrude Edge option, extrude both out sideways simultaneously, creating two new surfaces, and then select on each of my three faces and pull those out to add depth. I can then double click on an edge of this monitor to copy edges inward, again selecting on the direction I'd like to copy them, and then select on that newly created face, pull that in to create our monitor screen. With that screen still selected, I can go up to my Color tool in the Quick Access toolbar and change it to a black display. If I want to override the color of that display, I can triple click on any face of my solid. It'll select the entire solid. I can go to my Color tool to remove the color override, making that monitor green, which is the default color. So I'll then reactivate the top level design, and you can see the medical cart that we're starting to create here. So next thing I'd like to do is edit this table, the blue table. So let me select on the top face and go to section mode to get a 2D cross-section view of that table. And I can make edits in 2D cross-section mode just as easily as 3D. So I want to round off all four of these corners. So let me go ahead and select on one of my corners using the Pull tool, and then go to my Selection tab in my structure tree. You notice that it automatically finds similar geometry because of the option that I had set up earlier. If I go to the Options menu under Advanced, this option automatically calculate power selection will allow me to automatically calculate results when I click on geometry. So using the Selection tab, I can select all edges of similar length, and be able to pull to round those edges simultaneously. I can also create a bend feature in section mode. Select on that front face of the table and click and drag with my left mouse button to bend that table in or out. Now we'll go back to 3D mode and make a few additional edits. So again, I'll double click on the front edge of that table to select the entire chain, copy that chain inward to create a pivot point for that base, and now double clicking to select the outside edge chain, I can pivot that edge either into the part along the horizontal arrows, or if I escape out of that, I can select on the vertical arrows to pivot that downward, which is the motion I'd like to make. Now if I control click, double click on the other round chain, I can now pull on both of those edge chains simultaneously to round that table. And that completes our design of our table for that medical cart. So the last part that I'd like to feature a little bit more is our base part. So let's right click on our base component and choose Open Component to open that in a separate tab. And we can tab between our two designs, but we can work on this base separately. Now I want to split this base, so let me select on the axis going through the cylinder, create a new datum plane, and you see that it's oriented the wrong direction, but I can easily add additional references by selecting on the axis and then using my middle mouse button to scroll to select the back face. Control select both of those, and now it'll create a plane through the axis and normal to the back face of our base. Using our split solid tool from the intersect group, I can select on my solid that I'd like to split, select on the plane as my splitting plane, and you see that I've now split that base into two separate components, or two separate solids. I can now move those solids, so let me hide my datum planes, I don't need those anymore. And I'll select on the first solid, move that by dragging along the green arrow. We'll specify a movement of 300 millimeters. And we'll move our second solid, selecting it in the structure tree, and move it along the green arrow the same distance. So we've created some space in between our two solids. You'll notice that with the Move tool, I selected on the entire solid. If I'd selected on a face and moved along the blue arrow, it's going to move that face while following the geometry. If I select on an edge, it'll actually angle that edge by translating it through 3D space. Now if I select on a face with the Move tool and hold Control, same as you saw with Pull before, I'll be able to copy that face inward 300 millimeters to place that in between my two solids. And I'll edit this geometry, or this surface, by pulling out the right-hand side edge a certain distance and pull the inside edge in. And this will give me three faces to create a blend between. So I'll go back to my Pull tool, select on my three faces that I've created, Control selecting to select all three, and Space Claim will know that I want to blend by default, so when I hit Enter, it's going to automatically blend between those three faces. So now I can round off these corners, Control selecting both of those vertical edges. It wants to blend by default, but I can go and toggle that option off from my options menu, and then I'll be able to round those two edges. And now I want to draft that entire body on the right-hand side as well. So using my Select tool, I have two options of box select. I can do a box select from right to left, which is a partial select and selects anything that's partially in that box, or left to right, which is a full select and will only select any geometry that's fully within that bounding box. So now with all of that geometry selected, I'll pull, select my draft feature from my tool guide, and select the top face to draft about. So I'll draft about that face, specify a specific draft angle of 10 degrees, and complete that feature. Now if I select on the two edges on the back of my base and choose the pivot edge option from my tool guide, I can pivot those edges inward to angle the geometry of that base. And again, if I want to specify strict dimensions, I can do that at any time by selecting on the back face, choosing the ruler dimension that pops up from my mini tool guide, and choosing a reference to dimension off of. So I can expand that base out to 750 millimeters. And finally, to complete the design of the base, I'd like to select all three of the vertical faces on the back of that base, and right-click and choose to create a full round. So now that we've created our geometry for that base, we'll go back to our main design, and you can see that the geometry updates in our top-level assembly as well. Go ahead and hide the planes in the top-level assembly. We want to move these components to adjust for the changes we made. So let's select on our base component as well as our office chair component. And with the Move tool, we can move both of them simultaneously, horizontally, to center the mounting tower to the middle of the base. And then we'd like to select on our table, and we can translate that as well, translate that down to a more appropriate height. And so you can see our final assembly for our medical card assembly that we've created using conceptual design tools in SpaceClaim.